All right. Thank you, Sheila, for that kind introduction. I'm honored to be a part of this panel that's a very important and timely one, given the situation we're living in, the very tumultuous and difficult times. I'd like to start with December 7, 1941, when the imperial forces of Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, which began World War II for the United States against Japan. President Roosevelt called it a day of infamy, but for Japanese Americans, we called it years of infamy, because 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom American citizens, were taken from their homes, exiled from the West Coast states, put into feeded horse stalls, and transported across the country to the most dismal places in the United States to live in indefinite confinement in hastily built barracks, which were really prisons, and served their time there. The crime was Japanese ancestry. The justification was military necessity, that we had to put these people away because their ethnic characteristics, their status as Japanese Americans, or their background predisposed them to disloyalty. And also, they had committed certain acts of espionage. That was the basis for the legal justification and political justification. And these folks, including my parents, lived out their lives for 3 to 4 years in these places for indefinite confinement with total disregard of their constitutional rights. They had no right to a trial. They had no right to an attorney. They had no notice of the charges. They were just swept up, taken away to unknown places for an unknown duration. This was not an aberration, because if you look at the history of Asian Americans in this country, starting from the first Chinese Americans who came here, the Asian Americans have suffered very similar fates of first being welcomed as cheap labor and then suffering incredible discrimination in both the laws and in just their existence, violent hate crimes, destruction of entire cities. So that what happened to Japanese Americans was just a continuation and maybe a culmination at that point of the rivers of racism that just overflow during times of crises. And so Japanese Americans became marginalized, became the scapegoats. They became the, quote, enemy that needed to satisfy both economic and political interests at the time. 3 men stood up and challenged the incarceration of Japanese Americans. All 3 men cases went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that the incarceration, well, essentially the exile and detention, were constitutional. And they claimed that they accepted the military argument that, and the government argument that, again, Japanese Americans' ethnic and cultural characteristics predisposed them to disloyalty. There's a larger dynamic going on. The image or the impression of the perpetual foreigners that is visited upon Asian Americans, that we are not truly American citizens because really we're not white. And this is obvious because these rules that led the Japanese Americans to incarceration did not apply to Germans or Italians, and we were at war with them as well. And so why is that? It's pretty obvious that the racism that propelled these decisions was really confined to people of color, which were Japanese Americans. They were just subjected to different standards than white Americans, Germans, and Italians. 40 years later, evidence was discovered by researchers that the justifications for the incarceration, for the exile of Japanese Americans were complete fabrications. They were complete lies, and the government told these lies to the Supreme Court to justify what had been done to this group of mostly American citizens. Eventually, this evidence was presented to 3 different courts in the Western states. In the case that I worked on, Korematsu versus the United States, we drew the first hearing. And in that first hearing, we presented the evidence, and the Judge Patel here in San Francisco overturned Fred Korematsu's conviction, declaring that what was done to Japanese Americans was unjustified, that it was based on racism, and that the government had committed serious misconduct in the United States Supreme Court. This was at a time in 1983 when Japanese Americans led a movement of people of all colors, a rainbow coalition, to petition Congress to get relief for what they felt were unconstitutional deprivations of their rights. They started a movement. The congressmen and the Senate introduced bills to give Japanese Americans $20,000 in an apology for what was done. Hearings were held around the country, and the conclusion was very telling. The conclusion of the commission was that this disgraceful civil rights disaster and the broad historical causes that shaped these decisions to incarcerate Japanese Americans were race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. We hear those echoes of history today. What has been happening currently on the streets and in this country in terms of the types of violence committed against Asian Americans is also an echo of what happened in 1982 when Vincent Chin was brutally murdered. The murderers thought he was Japanese, and it was at a time when the United States was in serious competition with Japan. And in fact, Japan was overcoming or was winning some of the economic battles, especially in the automotive industry. So Vincent Chin was murdered in Detroit by out-of-work auto workers who blamed Japan for their plight when it was really the United States' failure and complacency that led to their reduction of the economic success. We've seen other people victimized afterwards, and a number of Asian Americans who were either mistaken for another ethnicity. Chinese were mistaken for Japanese, Japanese were mistaken for Vietnamese, Vietnamese were mistaken for other Asian groups. A number of Asian Americans were actually murdered or assaulted in the aftermath of Vincent Chin's murder. But we've seen it again recently. Think of Wen-Ho Lee and the racial profiling that is occurring against Chinese Americans, especially Chinese Americans today. But the spillover is that people in this country sometimes can't recognize the difference, or oftentimes cannot recognize the difference among the different ethnic groups. And so we are all victims. We are all potential victims. And if you see some of the video snippets of the kind of discrimination that's occurring, the yelling of going back to your own country, the actual physical assaults, we're hearing that echo of history today of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. The ultimate result is great fear of for me, just going outside and I don't live in San Francisco, but so it's not that this is some unusual occurrence. It's tied directly, I feel, and fueled by racist comments about China. And it has to do with the ostensibly the Chinese, quote, flu, the Kung flu, racist statements that really agitate non-Asians to commit actions against us. But there's a deeper reason. I mean, obviously, one of the deeper reasons is racism, and those rivers have overflowed again to impact our Asian American community. But there's also another reason, and that's the economic competition with China, which is now fueling again those kind of statements, because China is doing things in the international scale, which economically are a very huge competition for the United States. And in the future, you know, the United States is fearful. And so I think some of those reasons, not just the racism, but the economic competition, is causing non-Asian folks to react and react negatively. What we're afraid of is not just the everyday violence, but the kind of mass hysteria that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And while I think that we're going to find a lot more resistance than what happened to Japanese Americans, because nobody stood up and supported Japanese Americans, not one national group. And so we are alone. But when redress was passed, again, we had a political coalition of all colors that supported Japanese Americans. So for me, the lesson is to find those allies. And in order to find those allies, you have to be an ally. It means you have to support the legitimate aspirations of other marginalized groups. It means supporting Black Lives Matter, in my mind. It means supporting LGBTQ communities, because you can't expect to have allies unless you're an ally yourself. And it also means to organize among ourselves. We need to be strong. We need to be organized. We need to be resistant. We need to be aggressive about this. We cannot let another 1942 occur where an entire populace of ethnic Asian Americans were taken away without constitutional rights. So the simple lesson is we need to fight back. We need to work with allies. We need to educate this American public. And we need to understand ourselves why this is happening. It's not just because the flu originated in China, which was really spread more by Italy and Europe than anywhere else. We need to understand that this has happened historically before, and we really need to consider stopping repeating history. So the fallout of what Pivot to Peace is doing in a good way benefits us all, but not just because it's right, but because it's also helps both economies. It helps the world. It helps individuals. It'll slow down violence against Asian Americans, which I'm concerned about. And so I'm really supportive of their efforts to educate and activate people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that extremely informative talk, Dale. Before we wrap up with you here, in light of the Korematsu case, can you talk a little bit about the possible scenarios that could play out for the Chinese American community in the event that war breaks out with China?
Some folks ask whether the Korematsu case, one of the cases that sanctioned the incarceration of Japanese Americans or the exile, was repudiated. And yes, it was in some ways, but it doesn't matter what the law is in my mind. You can say whatever you want, but it's really the politics that govern whether drastic action such as the incarceration can occur again. If there's the political will to do it, it doesn't matter what the law says. The law could be overcome in so many ways. New laws could be enacted and people could disregard the laws. The Supreme Court can say, no, the Korematsu case is right. So my fear is that folks believe they're protected by laws, but they're not. It's really political action, political forces that will make the difference between whether there's going to be a drastic action such as an incarceration of an entire group.